to a Hope 1032 podcast.
Hello everyone, it's so good to be back with you. Welcome to Season 6 of Raising Teens. I'm your host, Collett Smart. I'm a psychologist, a teacher, and also a parent in the middle of raising my own teen and young adult children. I started this podcast because I know that many teens are struggling, and I wanted to create an online village of support for parents. I'm joined again this season by well-known experts on teen mental health and well-being. I have such hope for this generation of young people, so each episode is jam-packed with support so that you can get on with the job that you do best. That is, connecting with and loving your teen. Jas Rawlinson is an award-winning book coach, resilience speaker, and best-selling author who specializes in storytelling that inspires, challenges, and changes lives. Combining her lived experience as a domestic sexual violence survivor with a BA degree in creative writing and psychology, Jas is highly renowned for her natural ability to break through stigmatized social issues and transform shame into strength. She's the author of the series Reasons to Live, One More Day, Every Day, and the newly released The Stories We Carry, and is also the founder of Brisbane's first domestic violence memorial. Jas is also a proud anti-trafficking ambassador who has spent time with survivors and investigators in Southeast Asia, and in 2022 featured in front of 100 million people on Channel 7's award-winning TV series Adventure All-Stars. Please be advised that this episode contains discussions around domestic and family violence and mentions of suicide. If you find yourself feeling distressed at any point of this episode, for Australian listeners, please call Lifeline on 13 11 14 or your local helpline if you are elsewhere around the world. Please also refer to the numbers we have provided in the show notes. Hello, Jas. Welcome to Raising Teens.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.
So, Jas, I don't think you realize this, but I actually read an excerpt of one of your books when I was doing a seminar with a bunch of teenage girls in Sydney. Your work is incredibly inspiring and really impactful. I'd love you to tell us a little bit about your story. So just for my listeners to get an idea of your background, whatever you feel comfortable saying, I'd love you to tell us a bit about you and who you are and your work.
Thank you. And thanks for sharing that story too, because I wasn't aware of that. And it's always lovely to hear when people come across my work and that obviously it's impacting lives, which is very important to me. So my story began in a town called Coffs Harbour, sort of between Brisbane and Sydney. Most people have heard of it. And I grew up in this beautiful little mountain valley where I was very blessed to have, a childhood that had a lot of elements of innocence and privilege that a lot of kids don't get today. So obviously growing up before social media, I didn't have to worry about any of that kind of stuff. I could go exploring the mountains behind our house and crawl through foxholes with one of the neighbours, and we would ride some of the neighbours' horses, and I had dogs and chickens and all kinds of things like that were really amazing parts of my childhood. But then there was another side to my childhood that nobody really knew about except for those of us who were in my household. So I was 10 when I first developed really severe depression as a result of growing up in a home with a perpetrator of domestic violence, which was my father. And this is something I share a lot when I am speaking, especially with younger people, is that I didn't have any words to describe what I was going through at that age. So as an 11-year-old, 12-year-old, and then all the way through my teens, I don't think I really ever knew for a long time that it was domestic violence, because the only awareness we had about that in the late 1990s and the early 2000s was that domestic violence was a bruise on the face or a split lip or something like that. And we didn't have terms like coercive control that were well known. We certainly didn't talk about things like financial abuse or spiritual abuse, emotional and mental abuse. And they were all things that my mother and my brother and I experienced in our home with my dad. To cut a long story short, I was very depressed and anxious from the age of 10 and then became quite suicidal throughout my teens, which is why I'm very passionate about talking about issues like suicide prevention and mental health awareness, because we didn't really have that when I was growing up. And so I not only didn't have words for what was going on in our home, but also didn't really have words for a long time about the feelings that I was experiencing, which, led me to a real mental health crisis in my teen years, where the only way I can describe it is just this constant feeling of treading water. And as a teen, not believing that there would ever be an end to this pain. I didn't think I would ever go on to do anything of value in the world. I couldn't really even picture a life outside of school, because school is this all-encompassing kind of bubble when you're in your teens. And, those years were really hard. During that time, we went into a safe house for a period of 9 months. There was a time where my mother and my brother and I had to run across the paddocks to the neighbours, and we didn't even know if they were home, but we found an unlocked door and we went inside and hid there because we were so afraid of what my dad was going to do. And, there were many times looking back where we could have easily become statistics, and the emotional abuse and the control, and especially coercive control, really did escalate as I progressed through my teens. And then everything changed when I turned 18 and my dad actually took his life. So as a 18-year-old who had just recently graduated, I was in this position where I not only was carrying all of this trauma from almost a decade, but I was also a very emotionally damaged young woman going out into the world without any idea of how to set boundaries, what those looked like. And that understandably led me into some very, very toxic relationships, one of which ended in a sexual assault when I was 20. So that's kind of a snapshot of what I experienced in my teen years. And it's something that many other young people are going through at this very moment. And that's why I think it's really important to have honest and vulnerable discussions about what abuse looks like, but also about the hope that you can come out the other side of these things.
I so appreciate your honesty and your willingness to just share some of your story, because you mentioned there you didn't know that it wasn't normal, because as a young person or a child, you are in the family you're in. And I've heard that said a lot from some of my own clients and, other stories where people say, I didn't know that didn't happen in other families, or I didn't know what a healthy family looked like because my family was just my family.
Yeah, absolutely. I just, didn't have words back then.
Yeah. And I think when you say didn't have words, if it's not spoken about and we don't give young people or women the words, they don't know how to name what is going on for them, or even what they're asking help for. I'd love you to talk a little bit about perhaps a snapshot of some of the statistics around domestic and family violence in Australia, and then also perhaps a bit more broadly. We've got a lot of listeners from other countries as well, and we always think it happens somewhere else over there, some other street or neighborhood or some other country. We have no concept often that it is happening on our street. What do we understand about domestic and family violence?
Yeah, well, the reality of what's happening to women particularly, but people all around the world when it comes to domestic violence is absolutely disgusting and shocking. And I will go through some of those stats in a moment. But what you were speaking about when you said that a lot of people think, oh, this couldn't happen in my neighborhood. I think one of the best examples of that in recent years was what we saw happen with Hannah Clark and her 3 children here in Queensland. And that happened on the south side of Brisbane, but only maybe 25 minutes away from me, in a pretty good area. And people just, people even 3 years later are saying, how did that happen? How was it that a mother and her 3 children were killed publicly by her ex? So, that's just one of many, many examples, sadly, of what's happening, and that it can happen in every street and every suburb and every country around the world, which it does. Here in Australia, we know that 1 woman a week on average is murdered by a current or former partner. And in some cases, we've seen that rise to 2 women a week, or they say one woman every 10 days. It's absolutely shocking. I mean, here in Australia, the stats are that we see 1 in 6 women and 1 in 16 men who will experience physical or sexual abuse since the age of 15. And then globally, it's 1 in 3 women and girls who experience physical or sexual violence in their lifetime. And World Health Organization has found that intimate partner violence actually affects 30% of women worldwide. And those statistics are horrific, you know?
That's enormous. And so it's so complex, but we often hear that statement, well, if it's so bad, why doesn't she just leave? Can you unpack that a little bit for our listeners? What does that say to you and the experience of when you were a child? And then you also mentioned your experience as a 20-year-old. Talk us through why women can't just leave, or children as well, for that matter.
Yeah, I hear that sentiment a lot, and I do understand because I felt that way as a teen. I used to ask my mum all the time, Mum, why can't we just leave? Why can't we go? And when I look back now as a mother myself, I think, well, where would we have gone back then? For a lot of our childhood, we had one car that we shared between my parents. And even when my parents did have 2 cars, the car that my mother had was I think 1980 or 1985 Toyota Celica, a 2-door, old car. And you think, how do 2 children in primary and high school live in that with their mother if they don't have family that they can go and live with? And so lots of people ask this question of why doesn't the woman just leave, when the question should be, why doesn't the abuser stop abusing them? Or why does the victim feel that they can't leave? Which is a more important question to be asking, so that we can see what we can do as a society to make it so that victim survivors do have somewhere to go to, whether they're female or male, whether it's a teenager or a child. But we know that it takes a woman in particular, and I'm not sure what the stats are for men, but we know that for women it takes on average 7 times for a woman to successfully leave an abusive relationship. And there are so many factors. One of them is, as I mentioned, where does the victim survivor go to if they don't have anywhere to go to? Often abusive relationships will see one person financially bonded to the other one. So if they can't financially support themselves or their children, then again, where do they go? And then what we also often see is that the emotional abuse is so strong, and in a lot of cases is far more damaging sometimes than the physical abuse, because it really messes with the victim survivor's head. And this is what I experienced in this friendship relationship that ended in a sexual assault, was that there were patterns of grooming and there were patterns of gaslighting where this person, used psychological manipulation on me so that I would doubt my own memories of the experience. And he actually did that to me on the day of the sexual assault, where he was saying things to me like, oh, that didn't happen. You're not remembering it correctly. Oh, that's so cute. You can't remember what actually happened. He was taunting me. But as a 20-year-old, I didn't understand it, because there had also been so many good times and happy times with this person. So, and that's why this form of abuse is so insidious and so damaging, because with gaslighting and love bombing, which is where they will literally bomb you with so much adoration and love and mimic and mirror back all the things that you want to hear and what you want in a partner, that it becomes very hard to see what the reality is and to distinguish the good memories from the reality of all the other abuse.
When many people think of the term domestic and family violence or family abuse, what normally comes to mind is physical violence, but abuse can come in other forms as well. Things like controlling behaviours. These might look like controlling your finances or controlling where you go, what you do, what you wear, even who you see, or preventing you from making some of your own decisions. It can also look like verbal and emotional abuse. This can come in the form of blaming, insulting, even embarrassing you in front of others, and gaslighting. They may say things or act in ways that deliberately scare you. In terms of emotional abuse, you also heard Jas mention the term gaslighting, love bombing, and grooming. So what are these? Gaslighting is a calculated tactic for the abuser to gain more power and gets the victim to question their own perceptions and doubt their own memories. This can often sound like, "Oh, you're just crazy," or "You're just imagining things. You're remembering that all wrong. You're always so dramatic. Or you're just being hysterical." Or even, "I was only joking. I say those things because it's what everyone else is thinking." Or, "I was just trying to help you." Love bombing is a term that we hear in different situations, but in abusive relationships, it involves bombarding love onto a person. It could look like the abuser asking for a fresh start or seeming like a completely different person to the one who was abusive. It could include things like excessive affection, giving lots of compliments, declarations of love, gifts, praise. For the victim survivor, this can feel like a roller coaster of abusive situations with love bombing in between. Grooming then in an abusive relationship can target both children and adults. The common aspect is that the perpetrator manipulates a victim and the people around them by building trust and rapport. This can come through things like giving gifts, charming words, and then that love bombing that I've just mentioned. This can happen sometimes over weeks and even months before the abusive behavior comes out. The victim survivor can be left feeling confused because abusers are very skilled at manipulation.
That was definitely my experience where I couldn't see the reality of what was happening. Didn't have words for it again, and blamed myself for a very long time about what happened. And we know that survivors of sexual assault or domestic violence, that's very common.
That's such a good point you raised there about the love bombing, because during the times in between the violence, the emotional abuse, the sexual abuse, there can be very long periods where it seems normal or feels normal, or there is the love bombing that happens and you get lots of gifts and get showered with praise and attention. And then that is where it really messes with the survivor's thought processes, thinking, well, this is good most of the time, so maybe it isn't abuse. Maybe this doesn't qualify somehow as an abusive relationship because look how so many months go well and, it's just occasional. And I've heard survivors talk about the guilt that you mentioned there, where you feel like, well, was I somehow to blame because then I stayed, or maybe I misunderstood, and that gaslighting is such a big factor that I've heard, where you start to doubt your own thoughts and your own sanity in some ways.
Yeah, it's just so damaging. And in my work that I do as a book coach as well, I work with a lot of women who have been in abusive relationships and come out the other side, and they will talk about how, as you said, there are such long periods within a relationship where things are good, or the person is very caring and seemingly caring and understanding. And so it's really hard to decipher between all of that. And I certainly had that. It was many, many years. It was actually about 10 years from the time I was assaulted that I actually understood that there were components of intimate partner violence and abuse in that relationship, which was also confusing because it was, sometimes a friendship and then it was sometimes romantic relationship. And so, yeah, it's very, very hard to understand sometimes. And I think that's why it's really good that we are seeing a lot more discussion these days about these non-physical components of domestic violence, so that particularly teens, can understand what the red flags are to actually look out for.
So as a teen or as a child, were there any adults that you trusted enough to talk to about your experiences? What would or could help a teen to feel safe to open up to someone about what is happening in their life?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I was actually speaking with a journalist about this, about the power that teachers in particular have to help students through so many things, but there are so many things that teachers in particular can do beyond just mandated reporting. I know for me, I had a couple of teachers who were really there for me, and some of them didn't even really know the extent of what was going on. But they were really the only ones that I could open up to, because I didn't even tell any of my friends at school until I was 16. I told my best friend and my boyfriend at the time, and nobody else knew. All my friends thought my dad was really charming and that everything was perfect. But I did have a teacher who was really helpful and really there for me. Just things like being more flexible with deadlines. I mean, she knew that I was a student who put my all into my assignments. But when I was, in a safe house and then living with my friend's family for a while during sort of exams so that I could have some peace, I had so much pressure on me. I put so much pressure on myself. And I remember this teacher writing me a little sticky note and putting it on one of my boulders, just saying, "Jas, I'm here for you. Take your time. Take an extra couple of weeks." Something like that. I think she gave me, maybe an extension of a week or 2 weeks, which is really not that big in the grand scheme of things. She was my art teacher at the time. And I remember she also helped me out with just providing some extra resources for me to do my research. And she wasn't doing my work for me, but just being a caring teacher and just taking, she had no idea how much of a burden that took off my shoulders just to have some more breathing space and some more breathing room.
You may be aware that in many countries, adults who work with children are required by law to report suspected abuse or harm. I know that most teachers will talk to a supervisor if they are worried about a student. But I also know that teachers are feeling overwhelmed because they often don't feel as though they're trained counsellors and they're not sure about how to support the children in their classrooms who are struggling. Jas reminded us so beautifully there that it's the day-to-day stuff that teachers do that make a huge difference in a young person's life. Things like giving them a little extra time on a task, checking in on whether they would like to take a drink break, go and sit in a safe space set up at the school, or even to see the school counsellor. But even things like finding out about a child's interests, asking them about these each week, this can make all the difference to a young person. Because after their friends, teachers are the most important factor for supporting students' mental health at school. But then you may be an adult who's involved in a teen's life in a non-professional capacity. You may be a coach or a youth leader, or it may be one of your children's friends. Even though you may not have a legal requirement to report, I would really recommend that you cautiously check in with the young person. Perhaps you could suggest Childline, but also call Lifeline or 1-800-RESPECT yourself to ask for guidance. And if you are concerned a child is in physical danger, please contact your local police.
And I know there was another teacher who was there for me when I had a real mental health crisis at school. And again, he didn't know, and even to this day, I think it's only more recently that he's become aware of what I was actually going through. But, he was just caring. He made sure that I got to the counsellor's office. He didn't make me feel ashamed for what I was going through. And I think teachers, I'm sure a lot of them are aware of the role they play in a student's life, but if they're not, I think they need to know that they can really move mountains for their students, even if they don't know everything that's going on. It's just being someone who can hold space or just offer a bit more flexibility to help a student out.
Yeah. So you recently published your debut memoir, The Stories We Carry. You talk a lot about writing. I know you are a writing coach. How did you approach the writing process in a way to still avoid re-traumatization around your childhood trauma?
Yeah, it was a really big one. And it was interesting because I teach my clients a lot about self-care and how to approach traumatic memories in a way that helps to avoid re-traumatization. But there's nothing quite like going through it yourself. And I found that it is really difficult revisiting some of those early memories. One thing that I did a lot, and I recommend this to everyone out there, every parent, even like teens as well, is that I personally do a lot of EFT tapping. And I know a lot of psychologists are recommending that these days for their clients as well. If you don't know what it is, just go to YouTube and type in EFT tapping. You'll find a video for pretty much everything. But I also do a lot of videos just on YouTube around releasing trauma, or, there's ones for writer's block, there's ones for feeling triggered by certain memories. You can find something for everything. But that was a really big part of the process for me. And then also just accepting it for what it was, accepting that it was going to really suck sometimes to go back into these memories. It wasn't easy, but it was also very, very healing, and helped me to understand parts of myself that I just wasn't aware of. As I was reading through half a dozen journals or so from my teenage years, I came to understand that there was another relationship I was in that was very emotionally abusive. And I never realized that until I sat down about a year ago and read through those journals and went, wow, I just thought he was a bit of a jerk, or I just thought he was a teen boy who was a bit mean and a bit callous and lacking in empathy. But when I went back through, I was like, wow, I can see now the sexual coercion. I can see, just the emotional abuse, like the cruelty in a new way. So I think, I recommend to everyone to use journaling as part of their self-care and their resilience, because it's really interesting just what you can learn about your own self and your own identity through that process.
Yeah, and going back to your journals, I go through a process where I journal for months, and then I go through a period of time where I don't journal at all, and then come back to it. And it's fascinating going back to your old journals and seeing some areas you're still working through, other areas where you realize you've grown. I think you do get some insight into relationships and things that you were going through. When you were processing some of this, or you process some of this in your writing, do you have people around you that you can go to when you feel trauma coming up in various ways?
Yeah, well, again, I did a lot of work with an actual EFT therapist who's trained in, trauma therapy, because I was holding a lot of my trauma and stress in my gut, and also in my throat as well. And it's really interesting to see where we hold stress in the body. I know a lot of people are familiar with this now because of the work of, Dr. Bessel and books like The Body Keeps the Score. But there was a time, I think it was last year, where I was having a session with my EFT therapist, and as we were talking, I said, it feels like there's something in my gut that's trying to get out. Like it feels like it's pushing and trying to get out, almost like the movie Alien or something like that. It felt so bizarre. And I didn't realize how much I was carrying. I said, I shouldn't be feeling this way because I've finished the book. I've processed what I needed to, and I feel okay. But as we were talking about all the things that I'd gone through by writing the book and the memories that had come up and things around that person who'd assaulted me, I realized that I still had a lot that I was carrying within me. And I mean, that's part of why I called my book The Stories We Carry, because we all have stories and memories and things like that we hold in our body. And so it was really important for me to work with someone who could help me get that out of my body and shift it out. A lot of people might find talk therapy to be the best way to do that for them. Some people might find journaling or EFT. There are so many options out there. Like, we're very blessed to have lots of different tools in our toolkit these days. But I think it's just important that you get curious about what works for you and understand that the body does hold memories and it does keep the score. And it's really important to move those memories and that trauma out of our bodies so that we can live as free as possible from the adversities or the traumas that we've experienced.
Yeah. And so, just coming to your work in creative writing and gratitude journaling, can you just unpack a little bit more for us on how that can improve mental health, well-being, and we even see improvements in resilience?
Yeah, I've found, personally, but also as a as an author, as a book coach, that writing is a really powerful tool for resilience, for self-expression. And you don't have to be a writer to try any of this, even if it's just writing down 3 things at the end of the day that you're grateful for, or spending a bit of time just kind of venting on the page what's stressing you out. I was actually doing that last night in bed when I couldn't sleep. And it's a really effective way of just transferring all those thoughts that are cycling around in your head out onto physically something else. But journaling, there are so many benefits to that. Research has found it really helps with boosting resilience, with improving mental well-being and happiness, being open to more, positive opportunities in your life. They've found that it opens the door to just being aware of greater opportunities and things like that. And then there was one really interesting study many years ago that it was by Greater Good at Berkeley. And they did this study where they got, I think it was 200 people, but apologies if the number's wrong, but they had quite a few people who did this experiment where they wrote letters of gratitude to somebody in their life. And some of the people chose to mail those letters and send them on, and some of the people didn't. They just wrote the letter. And they found that regardless of whether the letter was sent or not, each person showed far greater levels of happiness. And when they attached some of these people to an fMRI scanner, they could actually see that there was greater activation of the prefrontal cortex, responsible for decision-making and learning. And they were able to see that these people, were experienced greater levels of happiness and were also more able to express gratitude in their lives. And I think some of the people, they did follow-up studies and found that even 3 months later, they still showed higher levels of happiness and higher levels of awareness for expressing gratitude in their lives.
Things like gratitude journaling and focusing on how far you have come can be such a fantastic part of a mental health plan. I've even written a chapter about gratitude, and if you're interested in finding out more about the Greater Good Institute, there is a link in the show notes. Other good ways to process your trauma may include finding a good psychologist. It is important that when you approach a psychologist or counsellor for you or your children, that you ask them whether they have qualifications in trauma-informed care. A good counsellor will also find safe ways to help you engage in self-care that is healthy for you. This might look like supportive abuse survivor groups, getting into some form of healthy exercise, helping your children find their tribe through sport or other activities. These all just form small but valuable steps in your journey.
Gratitude journaling, writing, it's so much more powerful than a lot of people really consider. And as I said, you don't have to be a writer to reap the benefits. It's just about giving yourself some space for reflection. And one of the really powerful things that a lot of my clients see, which I think is really powerful to share, is that when you do write out your journey, if you want to do something a bit more creative and look at writing your life story, even if you just do it in 2,000 words or something like that, you get to see on paper literally how far you have come. And it's really interesting because we often spend a lot of time thinking, I'm still struggling with this. I still have a lot of depression. I haven't moved on from this former relationship, or I'm still grieving about this family member, whatever it may be. But when I see my clients write out their life story, they look back and go, wow, I didn't realize that I had actually come so far. I didn't realize that I'm a different person now. So it can be a really, really powerful self-reflective exercise just for yourself,
Yeah. What do you think that women and children need from us, particularly in the time after they may have just come out of an abusive household?
Yeah, it's a really big question. I mean, obviously crisis support is kind of the most important thing. When a victim survivor literally has nowhere to go, the most important thing they need is housing. And obviously we know we have a huge housing crisis here in Australia in general. And so many women and children in particular are sleeping in their cars or are homeless. So, I mean, that's one of the most important things. But what I see as an advocate and, a survivor is that and I've seen this with a lot of my friends who are going through post-separation abuse as well, is that where they're really being let down is the justice system, because they're just not experiencing justice. We see so many cases of children being returned to the abusive partner or made to spend time with the abusive partner. I've got people close to me who are trying so desperately to keep their kids safe from an abusive partner, and the court systems are basically set up to fail. In a lot of cases, they say, well, maybe they were an abusive partner, but they're still a good dad or they're still a good mum. So they force the children to spend time with the abuser. And then we've got a whole new generation of kids who are growing up traumatized, who don't have a voice. They're not allowed to say, I don't want to spend time with dad or with mum. They're literally forced to go to that other person's home. And so that's where I'm seeing the biggest letdown. And, I wish I had solutions for this, but I think it's going to take decades to undo the damage that's been done by forcing victims and children to return to the abuser or to be part of their lives. I think back to my experience, and one of the things that was so helpful to me as a teen was that there was actually somebody in my mother's church who offered us that safe house, and it was meant to be for a period of 3 months. And she and her husband actually gifted us that house rent-free for almost a year, which is an enormous gift that is kind of beyond comprehension for me to think of. And I understand not everybody has a spare house, or, they were developing properties, so they were able to offer us a house before it went to development. But, if you are in a position to offer someone a place to stay, that's great. But also, there are lots of organisations out there that are doing the footwork. And I think if you're in a position to support one of them, either through volunteering or through donating, there are lots of great organisations like Rise Up and many, many others that can give a victim survivor and their children a place to stay, in a bed and brand new clothes and toiletries and all the things that, they need.
The organisation that Jas mentioned, Rise Up, is spelled RIZE. They have different programs and practical support for women and children. On their support page, there is a list of both national and state-based support programs in Australia. If you need help finding your local support service, please email Rise Up or call 1-800-RESPECT. And there is also 13 Yarn for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. We will also have links to organisations in a few different countries in the show notes of this episode.
Unfortunately, because of the failings that we are seeing on a government level or in the court systems, it is kind of up to community at the moment to step in where they can. So I think just look at what you can do. Like I said, if you're not in a position to financially support an organisation, maybe you want to see if there's a way that you can volunteer once a month or whatever it might be, or run a fundraising breakfast at your workplace. So many things we can do, but there's just so much more to do.
I know that you're really passionate about empowering teens and young people, and we've spoken about your work in rewriting shame into strength. What would you say to someone who right now feels defined by their adversities?
First of all, I want you to know that what has been done to you or what you've experienced is not your fault. And if you are in a relationship that is very abusive or toxic or just not a great situation to be in, please don't blame yourself for being in that relationship, or, if you've left, please don't blame yourself for not being further along in your healing journey, because, the things that were done to me and that have done to so many other survivors out there are never our fault. The only thing that we are responsible for is taking it one step at a time and one day at a time to try and find our way towards healing. And one of my biggest messages that I often share is that I really strongly believe that trauma doesn't have to be a life sentence. That's not to take away from the experiences that you might have had, but I just want to encourage you to understand that it doesn't have to define you for the rest of your life and doesn't have to be your burden to carry. just wherever you're at, just continue on taking it just one day at a time, one step at a time towards healing and exploring what options work for you. You know, what's best for you. It might be talk therapy and it might not be. It might be something more creative, but whatever it is, I just really encourage you to know that you can come out the other side of this, and that feelings are temporary. And there are a lot of women that I work with or who are friends of mine, and some of the things they say are that there is going to be an end to this. You know, this is going to come to an end at some stage, and one day this will not be the thing that defines me.
Beautiful. And so finally, Jas, what is your hope for teens who are survivors of domestic and family violence?
Oh, that's a big one. I think, first of all, my hope is that every teen out there learns the red flags and learns to understand what gaslighting is, what love bombing is, and understands that it's not only okay, but it's completely necessary to set boundaries in your life. You don't have to put up with abusive behavior. And it's really powerful when we are educated, you know, and we understand what to look out for. So that's one of my greatest hopes. And then for those, you know, young people out there who are going through some of the things that I went through, I just want you to know that, you know, I am living proof that you can come out the other side of these things. Like I said, if I look back to myself at age 15, 16, 17, I thought there is no way I will ever do anything interesting with my life. You know, if I get my driver's license, that's probably like the best thing I'll ever do. And I think, you know, there's so much waiting for you out there. Life outside of school is a whole different ballgame. And one day you will find your tribe, you will find people that understand you, and you'll realize that people around you who said negative things or who tore you down or bullied you or abused you, they're people that you can leave behind, and you can start again. You can always start again.
The stories of Jas and other people surviving and thriving is something important to hold on to. Jas mentioned that at the time she didn't believe she could succeed. If you feel similar, we want to show you that you don't need to be defined by what was done to you. If you would like to find out more about Jas's books or her work, you can go to jasrawlinson.com. You can also find me or leave a question for a future episode via email or my Facebook page or via raisingteens.au. Or you can go to the Hope 1032 podcast page. Please subscribe and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. I'd love to see you next episode, and in the meantime, keep parenting with your teen's future adult in mind.
This episode was hosted by Collett Smart, edited and produced by Alec Green, imaging by Lucy Weil, and social media by Beth Rivers.
Hope 1032. Thanks for listening.